Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Brenner, and I'd like to welcome you to Creating Collaborative Collections and Community Spaces, how state organizations can create meaningful partnerships during difficult times. We are proud to have Amanda McCrary Smith, who is the curator of textiles and fashion at the Tennessee State Museum, and Hobart Aiken, who is the cultural resource and exhibit specialist with Tennessee State Parks. They are here with us today to show us how two organizations, the Tennessee State Museum and Tennessee State Parks, envision a collaborative partnership that aids parks in developing their own collections over time and gives the museum physical spaces to allow for community engagement and programming across the entirety of the state. First, our session speakers will be presenting, and after their panel discussion has concluded, we will then take questions that everyone will be submitting in the Q&A box just to the right side of your screen in the Whova app or the desktop website. So please avoid putting things in the chat and make sure you're using the Q&A box there. I will now turn things over to our two speakers.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Amanda McCrary Smith, and as Spencer said, I'm with the Tennessee State Museum and the curator of textiles and fashion there. I have been with the museum now for about a year and a half. It'll be 2 years, but counting from when I was an intern in June. So I'm relatively new. And with this particular presentation, I think it's interesting having gone to all of the panels previous to it, where they did talk a lot about collaboration and networking. And I realized that our presentation is almost a case study in how that can happen during a time period where, you know, we've had some financial struggles and we've had issues related to the pandemic. So it's kind of a timely thing to talk about, but I also wanted to highlight the length of time that we've both been with our respective agencies, because I am new and Hobart is not. And so, you know, through that process, I've learned a lot, even though I think this presentation is actually more about me teaching him things. I'll turn it over to Hobart and let him introduce himself, and then I'll start sharing my screen.
Hey folks, I'm Hobart Aiken. I am the Cultural Resources and Exhibit Specialist for State Parks. I have been with Tennessee State Parks for 13 years now, so I've been with the organization for quite some time. I started off my career as one of the park rangers at Old Stone Fort State Archaeological Park in 2008. And then moved on to Fort Loudon, where I was a ranger for several years as well before moving on here. So yeah, I've been in the organization for quite some time, but this has been kind of an exciting thing that been exciting to work with Amanda on. So yeah.
Well, I'm gonna share the actual presentation here. Give me just a second to make it full screen. All right. So just a note on the title. I called it this because we really are creating, through this project, a collaborative means of learning about collections. And then eventually, hopefully, a collaborative sense of our collections in general. So like the ability to share them. And then, you know, Parks is an organization that's synonymous in a lot of ways with community space. And I think that's a really important aspect of Parks, that they have these community-minded, both physical and, you know, now virtual spaces for people to gather, for people to meet. And I think that's something that we could probably expand a little bit more on at the museum, maybe even out into the areas that Parks has. So that's the reason for the name of this. And I'm going to go ahead and let Hobart start with some of the history of museums in state parks.
All right, yeah, so as Amanda said, museums have been part of parks for quite a long time. I mean, the National Park Service has had museums to help interpret their sites almost from really from the early 1900s. In state parks, so the first state park museum that we had was at Meeman Shelby State Forest Park out in Shelby County, Tennessee, near Millington. And this museum was it is intended, well, was, because the building is unfortunately no longer there, but was intended to kind of help provide visitors to the park with some ideas about, the types of flora and fauna, as well as some of the cultural items that came from the park's nearly like 13,000 acres that are out there. And so out there along the Mississippi River. So the museum there is really kind of intended to be a place or was intended to be a place where you could have some kind of place-based interpretation that revolved around objects and specimens that came from the park. Now, the park itself, the museum itself, is really the heart of the collection that was there. Was donated by Mac Prichard in 1955. That was actually Mac Prichard's first gig with state parks in 1955. And for those of you guys who don't know who Mac Prichard is a very famous figure who will come up a lot during this presentation in state parks and in the conservation movement in the state of Tennessee. But the museum that he kind of like has the core with there at Neiman Shelby is really the first museum that we have in parks. Later on, Tennessee State Parks takes this idea of having museums and nature center and parks, and they explode and kind of proliferate, especially during the 1960s with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which funds a lot of construction and development in parks in the mid 60s and 70s. And by the 1970s, Tennessee State Parks actually had an exhibit crew that operated out of Nashville, and they had an office in Cookeville at one point too. And it was a crew of roughly like 8 to 10 people at one point who were doing exhibits in parks and in park museums for quite some time. That crew was disbanded in the late 90s, the early 2000s, and that was reduced to one individual who retired around the same time as well too. And since then, Tennessee State Parks has had really just kind of one person in the in kind of the exhibits role since then. But museums have been like a really like a critical and key component to the interpretive strategy at a lot of our parks since the 1970s. So, we bring up Mac Prichard because Mac Prichard was kind of the gateway for a lot of this partnership here. Mac Prichard is who passed away just this last year. Was a very important person in state parks, in the history of state parks, and not only that, but also in conservation in the state. Mac is responsible for getting 40 natural areas, archaeological parks, and just state parks added into the system. He was the first head of the Division of Archaeology. He also headed the state natural areas program for many years, and he was heavily involved in conservation organizations across the state throughout his entire life. In many ways, Mac really kind of drove a lot of the conversations, or was involved in a lot of the conversations around conservation and preservation of wild spaces throughout the park system. And so that's been like a big portion of where we have been, like where this partnership has been headed, because one of the things that happened this last year was as we started to after Mac's passing, I started to reflect on, we have all of these items in state parks, and we've had these museums for so long in state parks, but we've never really, kind of like a lot of institutions that started in the 50s, state parks kind of these things grew kind of by accident. So they didn't have policies, procedures in place to kind of protect these things. So I started reaching out to some of the contacts I knew in the museum world. So I reached out to people like Amanda, who I'd met through school, to kind of figure out what we needed to do with these things. Because as these collections have grown, it's really kind of become like an unwieldy kind of thing over time. It's one of those things where without having all of these policies and procedures in place, it's difficult to know what's where and where things are. And it kind of actually in some ways jeopardizes the institutional memory inside the organization, because it's tough to know, kind of where things are. So as we approach the centennial of state parks, which will be in 2037, so state parks is founded in 1937, or established in 1937. Most of the parks were built starting with the New Deal in 1933 through 1937, or the 16 core parks of that era were constructed around then. But as we approach the centennial, collections like the stuff that came from Mac Prichard's house are going to be increasingly important to us. So like I said, looking for a partner and another sister state agency who could kind of help us advise us on how to care for these things. And maybe we can use a lot of the stuff as we as we partner together to build our own collections policies and become better stewards of some of the items that we have collected over the, 60 years since we've had museums in parks. And so that led to reaching out with folks to the Tennessee State Museum.
And it also it's important to note that what Hobart, like I'm responsible for one small part of the collection at TSM. And, I participate, of course, in other aspects of our collection. But Hobart, you want to talk a little bit about what you're actually responsible for?
Oh, yeah.
A lot.
Yeah, so in Tennessee State Parks, I kind of fill the void of a historian and kind of a general like catch-all for a lot of cultural resource stuff. But one of the other main purviews of my job is in advising parks on caring for their collections that they have in their parks. And I do this in conjunction with, sometimes I do this in conjunction with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology, who holds a lot of our objects. But there's also, with these collections, there's a lot of objects that have been donated like over time. One of the big examples of which is the Lenore Museum out at Norris Dam, which has a museum curator assigned to it, but it really doesn't, it was something that was set up in the 1970s and wasn't set up really in a way that that has a lot of like good policies and procedures in place for the care of the collections there. And it was something that was kind of done in an effort to tell the story of the area around Norris Dam State Park before the creation of the dam. And so I've been brought in to advise some of the folks there on some of that stuff. But as soon as I got in there, I have my hands in a lot of different pots, and there's some things that I need to be willing to admit I don't know as much about. And one of the things that they have there that I really don't know as much about was a collection of clothing items, of textiles that were in a case there. So that was when I started really thinking too about people I could reach out to inside state government who understand textiles and understand these collections, who could help advise me, because I mean, none of us can all know everything. And there shouldn't be the pressure to feel like you have to know everything. And it's a lot of a lot of times like that I find that are valuable professionally for me is when I have a professional network of people who I know I can go to and talk to about such issues. And so Amanda was one of those individuals who we actually met. Both of her and I are in the PhD program at MTSU, and we actually happened to be sitting across from each other in our first class and started kind of talking about things. So when this issue cropped up at Norris, I called Amanda, which actually came up before kind of this next collection that we'll talk about. But through starting this discussion about the clothing items at Norris, when Mac Prichard passed away, and there were some pretty significant items at Mac Prichard's house that told the story of state parks, that told the story of conservation in Tennessee, I was able to, it made me think that to talk to Amanda about a lot of this, because a lot of these things are textile items. One of which in particular, you'll see down there in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen is Mac's jacket. Mac's jacket was, if you went to any kind of event where Mac Prichard was at, where Mac was trying to organize or put together some kind of a citizen involvement group, Mac would be wearing this state parks jacket. It's in a lot of photos, it's in a lot of places. But it was something that much like the clothes at the Lenore Museum, it had been in a very humid environment for a long time. And I really didn't know a lot about how to care for and handle that thing, handle that jacket. So being able to reach out to somebody like Amanda Smith at the State Museum and ask her for help with that. But it also, there was another thing too there, is that by doing this work together, I was also able to approach the State Museum about taking on these items as well too from Mac's house for a collection at their institution to help preserve this aspect of Tennessee State Parks history. And not only Tennessee State Parks, it's really bigger than Tennessee State Parks history. Mac's life is, like I said, Mac was really in every major conservation discussion. You will find evidence of Mac Prichard having contributed or been a part of it. And so it's a really important collection. So, there were other issues too, whereas if state parks brought these on.
So I'll talk a little bit about the actual concerns for handling the collection. When Hobart like you said, when we first met, we met in school, and I get a lot of textile questions in general. I have a lot of people just, ask me, hey, how do I take care of this? Or what about this thing? And I was actually approached by the Norris Dam Museum, separate from talking to Hobart about it, and then, scheduling a time to go up there to talk to them about their textiles. But then this Mac Prichard collection came up, and the impetus to preserve it is something that really helps interpret Tennessee's conservation history in a way that's so valuable. Like, I can't understate that, and we'll talk about why he wants to do this in just a second. But when Hobart told me that there were condition problems, I don't think I really understood exactly how extreme those condition problems are. And that's something where, if you don't know a lot about textiles, or if you are intimidated by them, which a lot of people are, because textiles are not something that people are used to handling, especially historic ones, they present problems that other museum artifacts tend not to, which is, there's mildew, there's humidity concerns, there's pests. In this case, they were kept in an environment where all of those things factored into their condition, but they also can't be brought back to the museum in that state. So they have to be, either aired out or what have you. And so we went through a pretty elaborate process of taking them to the Radnor Lake, to a facility at Radnor Lake, getting them aired out, getting them packed up correctly to take to the museum. And if Hobart hadn't have reached out to me about that, they may have just gotten packed in a box and further deteriorated, or developed a pest problem at whatever facility they were taken to. So it was a really smart thing to say, like he said a few minutes ago, I need help with this because this is kind of a mess. And I was able to go through the steps of proper care and proper packing of these items and proper cleaning a few of them. But the reason that this collection is so important, and why it's something that needs to be preserved both at the State Museum and for state parks, is something I'll let Hobart tell you about.
Yeah, so we are in state parks looking for a way to really commemorate Mac's life over this next couple of years. And for those of y'all who aren't aware, there is a Mac Prichard Day on May 31st that will be it'll be a day where we're doing stuff in state parks. And but one of the things that we've talked about doing is, if we can get Mac's collection stabilized, is we'd like to have a traveling Mac Prichard exhibit that talked about Mac's life and Mac's influence on conservation at several sites across the state. I mentioned, Mac was involved in the acquisition of over 40 areas into state lands. So that's through we have inside TDAC, which is the parent organization for state parks. There's several land management agencies. There's state parks. There's also the Division of Natural Areas, which manages really kind of rare and unique natural areas with rare and unique ecosystems. There's also the Division of Archaeology, although we do most of the state parks does most of the land management in partnership with the Division of Archaeology. But between those three organizations, Mac was involved at over 40 sites for that. So Mac's footprint on the landscape is out there in a big way. So one of the things that we've talked about doing is taking the jacket that we saw on the previous slide and installing it in a mobile exhibit to travel around to sites that Mac was instrumental at, and talk about Mac Prichard and his life, to also in a way to inspire people to continue Mac's legacy of community, of organizing to save some of these special places, these special unique places that are iconic to who we are as a state. Mac was really good. If you guys can there's a couple of websites out there that have some of Mac Prichard's. You can watch Mac Prichard's presentations on a couple of websites out there, and you'll see that Mac was always about getting people fired up about preserving unique landscapes that were iconic to who we are as Tennesseans. Be they natural, archaeological, or cultural of some kind. Mac was all about them. So having a mobile exhibit that can travel around to some of these places and encourage, like, the next generation of conservationists to take up a similar, kind of Mac's charge into the future would be something really powerful that we could do. And having some of these objects that otherwise, honestly, would, like as Amanda said, they were in real jeopardy And it would have been real hard for state parks to take that on ourselves. We don't, really have the facilities or training to really kind of do a lot of that stuff. But to work with Amanda and them to have something like this would be really, really great. We're still working on funding it. We've not done that yet, but we're hoping to try and have something here in the near future to where we can use these objects that have come out of the Mac Prichard collection to continue talking about Mac, his life, and his legacy.
And also having, these artifacts being added to our collection, and part of the Tennessee State Museum. One of the reasons for this partnership that we've taken on, and like the training and collections so that parks can develop a collections policy, is that has to be in place for our artifacts to be shared with another agency. So if, when we do loans, we have a certain criteria for loans, outgoing loans. And so there has to be that kind of, the conditions in place where we could loan out this jacket. And so through learning from us, it will make this exhibit possible in terms of actually having an artifact in it. And that is something that we'll talk a little bit about next, which is how we as the Tennessee State Museum could help state parks. So we already have a well-established collection policy that, it changes too. Like we reevaluate it and we take steps to make sure that it's current. It's elaborate. It has just about every step for anything that might come up involved in it. But that manual, that collections policy, could be used as a model for state parks and for Hobart to look at and to think toward, how do we want state parks to go about creating a collections policy. And I think a lot of it will probably be modeled on ours because they are also a state agency, which means we will have a lot of similar rules regarding things like state property, what have you. We also have experienced curators and staff. So, we have a curator for several different types of objects, and I specifically am in charge of textiles. And so with this collection having so many textile artifacts in it, so many things that did require knowledge about how to handle them, that was a really important part of this process, was to give that advice, to give, and to physically, I think, it says here on the screen, I could demonstrate how to deal with textiles. I think that's one of the more important parts of this process, is to actually physically be able to show you, or to show anyone, this is how you do this. Because, there are some objects, especially with clothing, that not only require special handling, but really, like, every item is individual and needs to be packed differently. If you look on the screen here, what you're looking at is Mac Prichard's political button collection, which so I could talk endlessly about how I did not understand the sheer amount of Mac Prichard's political buttons. I knew who Mac Prichard was before we started this project, and I remember that Hobart showed me the jacket, and I was not aware that there were boxes and boxes of his buttons. But we talked about yesterday, we were talking about doing this presentation, and I mentioned that, if somebody else had these buttons other than a museum or somebody who's used to handling objects, they might just get all thrown into a bucket. But instead, I arranged them and hung them and made them nice and neat and organized. They need to be labeled, but there are 476 of them in this collection. And that's something that, if you are not someone who is experienced with collections management or collections practices, you might not know how to go about storing or caring for 476 buttons. This is something that I have given Hobart a very hard time about for ages, because of the sheer number of these buttons. But then on a serious note, we can also, one of the things that I really like about this project is I, as a former teacher, I believe that I should act as a teaching resource. I should act as an educational resource, as a sort of outreach to both the public and other agencies. And so the museum is able, through this project, to serve that purpose, and in turn help parks with their collections practices. So I'll let Hobart talk about what parks gets out of this project, and then I'll talk about what we gain from it.
Yeah, so working with the State Museum and working with another sister state agency, like as Amanda talked about, like since they're another state agency, they have a lot of similar policies and procedures to us, like in other ways, but having a collections policy that is kind of mirrors theirs will be able to help us out quite a bit. So being able to work with them. And, you know, I've been working with and I meant to add this earlier, I've been working with the State Museum for quite some time, both in efforts across the state. During the centennial of the Great War, we worked with some of the curators over there. And it's always been a very rewarding process to work with a sister state organization that has been able to like help us out in a lot of ways as far as being able to provide objects and provide guidance on objects. But, you know, by having a good solid collections policy that really helps Tennessee State Parks museums out in a lot of different ways. One of which is, you know, we could look at potential accreditation of some of our facilities to where we could have things that could rotate through the museums. I know a lot of our museums reach a lot of small communities that are not they're not necessarily they're not right off the beaten path in some instances. Some of them are in pretty rural areas, and it would be a chance if we had museums that could be have some accreditations and be able to be, you know, kind of meet the criteria to get rotating exhibits. That would be something that would be great to be able to bring to some of these communities. Would be some things that they ordinarily wouldn't be able to see, but also specifically objects and artifacts that may speak to the community's history itself that may just be, you know, in Nashville. So this would be a really powerful chance to partner and be able to talk about the history of communities, the history of the state in ways that we've never really been able to do, just kind of given the way our museums have functioned. And so, you know, that also provides us with another way of interpreting, you know, parks and parks history. You know, we have a lot of really good interpreters in parks. I mean, you know, we're well known for doing like living history programming, for doing guided hikes and that kind of thing. But interpreting objects is sometimes it's a little bit of a different animal. And so being able to work with the State Museum and being able to work with the curatorial staff of the State Museum on object handling, but also interpreting objects and how to really look at and think about objects is something that will also be really a benefit to our interpreters in the park, but also to the people who manage our museums and nature centers across the system as well. You know, it's one of those things too where, you know, by doing this, we'll also kind of help the public realize just kind of the really important historic resources that are on our parks. I think a lot of times it's easy for people to fall into kind of not a trap, but like fall into like a mindset that there's not that state parks have a lot of really beautiful scenery. They've got really nice, we've got inns and we've got cabins, but there's also a lot of history on the parks. There's a lot of really important history on parks. We have numerous National Register properties. We have, I think, 6 National Historic Landmarks in parks. There's some real like serious cultural property there. So being able to work with the curatorial staff and bring that other element into our interpretation will be really powerful. And, you know, again, having this relationship established, like all relationships are incredibly valuable for advice and for collaborations in the future. You know, being able to hook in a park manager or a site manager with somebody from the State Museum for advice on collections or on thinking about an object is always valuable. Amanda can attest, I text Amanda pretty regularly with questions. And so being able to expand this network is really valuable for our organization because it gives us a whole nother way of looking at and approaching how we do interpretation in our parks.
And I actually really enjoy questions, which makes that, even for me, like I said, as a teaching resource, I do enjoy all of those questions. So in thinking about what the museum gains from it, and specifically in a lot of ways what I have gained from it, because I mentioned at the beginning I have not been with the museum for very long. My background is in education, and I came to the museum first as an intern, and then I was hired as the textile curator. So for me, it's been a really interesting way to learn more about the infrastructure of state government is one, the history of state parks is another, because I also really love environmental history, and I haven't, I've learned a lot just from Hobart telling me things that I didn't know about, state parks. But it's a unique opportunity, like it says, to serve the public and to serve another state agency. But it also was something where with this Mac Prichard collection, the museum doesn't have an extraordinary amount of artifacts that do interpret environmental history, especially modern conservation history, which I think is something that's especially important right now. We may have artifacts that relate to something like the TVA or, big environmental or big projects that had environmental impact in the state, but we don't necessarily have something as modern as Mac's jacket, which is a completely different side of environmentalism and conservation. And to have that in our collection is something that long-term means we will be able to interpret that history for years to come. And I think for me, that's something that is very important about this project. And then unexpectedly, I realized how much a collaboration would help me and us at the museum with future research. I can't see it because there's a window over it, but this picture is Great Falls Mill in Rock Island State Park. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now is doing some research into Tennessee's textile industry, which is, if you don't know anything about it, a lot of people probably don't, it's a pretty big operation. There were a lot of textile mills all around the state, especially in places where there were, rivers like the Caney Fork that run fast, and there were mills all up and down the river. And I only really knew about the Great Falls Mill. I wasn't aware that there was a network of mills up and down that river until I started looking at some research, or started looking at some sources for it. And, the fact that the building, the actual mill, not the mill works, are in state parks is something where I can reach out to Hobart and say, hey, tell me more about this. Put me in contact with this person, and he knows everybody. And I don't really know very many people. And so when I need some extra information about textile history, I'm working on a project about the strike in Elizabethtown. I always say it wrong. But I'm working on a project to do that. And that also is something where I can reach out and say, can you help me with some of this information? And it's really been a valuable way to kind of share research or to share resources and contacts. I told Hobart yesterday, it helps that I'm willing to pretty much talk to anyone, and so is he. And so reaching out to your networks is maybe a little easier for me than it might be for some people, because I will call anyone on the phone and say, please help me. But having an intermediary there is nice, so that someone doesn't just call, or I don't just call somebody out of the blue for research help. And then also, of course, the mission of the museum and the mission of state parks. I think it's really nice that this partnership kind of allows for a sharing of values, which is interpreting the history of Tennessee. I think what it can do is, the sheer breadth of history across our state is huge. And if two big organizations that both interpret Tennessee history can share their resources, and then eventually maybe their artifacts even, you get a broader scope of history and a better interpretation of it. And then what are the long-term possibilities of this project? We've touched on a couple of them already. I know that Hobart mentioned outreach to rural areas. I kind of envisioned that this is probably a good time to talk about how this relates to the pandemic and COVID-19 and where some of these ideas were born out of how it relates to the pandemic. I thought a lot about how there are homeschool programs. Well, now I guess a lot of people are having to develop homeschool programs. And, parks having these significant amount of facilities within them would allow for places like a museum or educators in general to come and have a safe place to congregate and maybe do some type of hands-on history. But like he said, there are rural areas where they don't get a lot of community-based interpretation or exhibits. And so you also have that opportunity to bring history to them, to bring their own history to them. And I think that's a really important way to get people interested in history. In one of my classes, we've talked pretty frequently about our own experiences when we were young and what influenced us to become historians. And almost all of them involve being told about your local history. And I think that's something that can occasionally get overlooked, that rural community-based history that is so important for young people to learn. So I think Parks offers that opportunity to bring that to people. And then it also is, I'll let Hobart talk about what it would mean if Parks was a collecting institution. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. So by working with Amanda and her colleagues over at the State Museum, if we can get a better collections policy or like a collections policy, it allows us to do a better job with kind of the collecting that does go on. We still have people drop stuff off at parks all the time. And it's done in kind of not a very systematic way, but by adopting a policy, we could be more focused and be more strategic in some of these acquisitions that do happen in parks from time to time, which would allow us to better interpret the things that we do have, but it would also allow us to kind of see where we have gaps in the things that we have in our park museums and maybe kind of help to fill those gaps. So, by working with the folks at the State Museum on this collections policy, which I've forwarded around a lot, and I've seen theirs, it will really help us to be better as an institution and collecting as a collective institution, collecting things across the state. But yeah, and this
it also sorry.
That's all right.
It also allows for an opportunity to, there may be things that are especially relevant to state parks that we may not take into the collection that parks would. And so you end up with more things that are preserved over time because you have a large agency that is participating in collecting. Another thing that we envision from this that I think is important, especially for the pandemic, and how we are learning and how we are meeting these days, is a curriculum of sorts for TSP staff. I think this was originally how we conceived of this project, was thinking about training. And, some of the people who work in the museums that Hobart oversees, or that he helps with exhibits and with their collections, I could offer them, our curatorial staff, all of the people who have collections management experience at TSM are able to offer that advice or offer that kind of training through a series. I think we envisioned it originally as a series of maybe a hands-on workshop every now and again for certain aspects of collecting, but then realized this virtual program or virtual platform that we use all the time offers a unique opportunity to maybe record, a set of lectures or a set of demonstrations or have a live Zoom. And Hobart pointed out the other day that as much as we're used to using Zoom and virtual resources, it would be so easy to schedule a Zoom meeting and have a person say, what is this thing? Can you help me, figure out something about this object? And so there's also that opportunity too, is that it's bringing training and bringing advice into this virtual realm where we can share things really quickly. So I think depending on what happens with the pandemic, I think there's an opportunity for both things, hands-on training and learning, but then also kind of almost like a resource library for people to go to and say, okay, well, TSM has this video on how to care for silk, and I could give that. And those resources are out there. I know on one of the previous panels, there was someone shared like the larger, I think it was the Heritage Project's conservation care and materials care information. But I think sometimes those resources can be really overwhelming. I think they're incredible resources, but if you're not a person who is already familiar with collections management or with, materials care, you get kind of it feels like it's a lot, like you don't know where to start. And so if you had a more local resource that could say, you could go to and say, oh, they have this video, and then this is an actual human being I can call later or email later and ask for extra advice. So I think that's kind of where we envision it going. Of course, there is the issue of time. Money, of course, as we all know, becomes an issue. But it's something that's why this is called long-term possibilities, because all of this aspect of it is kind of theoretical. And we are working now just to get Hobart and Tennessee State Parks developing their collections policy. Right. And I think that is about it. I'll let Spencer take us back over, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you both very much for that. And I just want to mention, you did say it right, Elizabeth, and my institution borders that town, and we actually have a textile collection, and I'm going to be showing the Bimberg strike videos here shortly. So,
really,
speaking of collaboration,
yes, you need to get in touch with me because I'm doing some preliminary research on it. But I always flub it because there's Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and it's like I have it right until I have to say it, and then I start to doubt myself and think, oh no, I have to say it, so I just admitted my own faults and tried it both ways.
Hey, honesty is a great policy, but a lot of these questions you've actually touched on. So I'm just going to go by the upvotes, and you might be able to kind of dive in a little bit more. And you were just talking about online resources. And one of the top question is, could you recommend any online resources or webinars that could help us continue our education on how to handle and care for textiles specifically?
Well, I'm doing a seminar at this conference at 1:00 if you want to learn the basics. But actually, I'm going to be talking more about preventative care. But things like the National Park Service conservograms are really great. I mean, I don't know everything. There's all kinds of different materials out there, especially, in the textile world, and especially synthetics. I mean, there are materials where that are brand new, that are they're things that are difficult to determine what they are, and they're difficult to figure out how to take care of them because they are new. And so things like conservograms can point you in the right direction. There's also I went to California State University at Long Beach for my textile program. They have some good resources on their continuing education website for things like textile storage. You can also always, and I told myself I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it. You can also reach out to me personally if you have any questions, because a lot of people do that, and I'm able to help them just more immediately if it's something that I can answer. But that brings up another point is, reach out to the textile person around you. There's always like the Southeast Conservators website if you're looking for conservation, but that of course is not free advice. That is something that's a little bit more expensive, but those are some resources that I can think of off the top of my head.
Oh, thank you. And I think that seminar that's a really good sell for that one.
Thanks.
The next question, I'm going to ask Hobart this first. but it's really for both of you. But what is the biggest challenge with textile preservation that you have both experienced? So I guess we'll start with Hobart there. Do you have any, maybe that jacket?
Yeah, so the jacket came out of and it was something like I mentioned in the presentation. I really didn't know, I mean, it was been stored in a very humid environment in a basement for quite some time. By the time I got to it, but then the other things that we have are we usually have objects that have been, especially textile objects that have been hung in the same place for decades. Usually with issues when they were designed, the museum space was not designed really thinking about exposure to light, temperature, climate controls around the things themselves, and that was mostly it's a relic of the time and when those museums were designed. A lot of them were designed, like I mentioned, in the 60s and the 70s. Some of them as early as the 50s, although there's not as many of those left. Matter of fact, I don't think we have any museums from the 50s left. They're all from that Land and Water Conservation Fund era, so from the mid 60s on. So yeah, most of them that we have are climate issues, climate and display issues. Most of our we don't have a lot of collection storage space that's, everything's either out or it's not. Is usually kind of how it is. So most of the real textile issues that we've had are just from something that's been on display for decades. So
for me, because I do work within museum environment, we, most of the things we have there, of course, are properly stored. It's when things come in as donations, or I've gone out to look at a potential donation, and improper storage, I think, is probably one of the biggest issues surrounding textile preservation. And some of it has to do with, there are a lot of old practices out there for like home storage that people, I almost hesitate to say this because I feel like it sets off some outrageous debate every time I tell anyone this, but don't put your textiles in a cedar chest. That is one of the things where they come, and it does prevent pest infestations, but a lot of times like the wood will leach onto the textiles, and so you end up with staining. So just like some of those things that people believe, like mothballs, cedar chests, hanging items. I think older textiles do better folded than hanging with all of the weight on the seams and the shoulders. And of course it does depend, every textile is individual, but I think that's one of the biggest problems that occurs for me when we get a donation, is that somebody has stored it in a way that is maybe not best practices. But they thought it was, so it's difficult to be too critical of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Best practices are always getting better. So what was best 20 years ago is no longer best. And this is gearing more back towards the policy. So what advice would you give other museums working on or developing a new collections policy?
I'd say ask around for sure. I know that I've had mine, the one that I've been working on, out to several organizations. I think these things only get stronger the more eyes that you have on them. Sometimes, so if you can have somebody, and even somebody from the outside looking in will see something that I will miss, because I live, breathe, and eat Tennessee State Parks all the time. So I think reaching out to those contacts and these professional networks that we develop, like through TAM, are really, really invaluable in one of these policy things. So my advice to anybody writing these things, and I've had to do these for not only for collections, but I had to write a black powder historic weapons demonstration policy last year. And so I reached out to people I knew in the National Park Service to help provide guidance and help look at what we were doing to try and make things better. So that would be my advice to people, is really reach out to those professional networks.
Well, there's also, of course, the big resources like the American Alliance of Museums and their best practices and ethical standards. And, that's always kind of like a framework or guide that you can go by. But Hobart's right. Like if you're a small organization without a collections policy, or even big organization without one, and you want to get started, reaching out to somebody with a long established one is probably a way to kind of get started as a resource. And I've found that even though I am new to the museum in general, and this is my first TAM conference, people are so friendly and so willing to share. Like, this is a really big change for me from academia, where everybody's kind of protective of their, their research and everything. Like, people in the museum world are just really open to sharing their knowledge with you. And I think that's a really nice thing.
Absolutely. I think the TAM conference is a testament to that as well. All right, another one. Does the Tennessee State Parks also collaborate with the National Park Service on collections issues and or exhibits?
We have not reached it. I mean, I've put out feelers and tried to talk to some people at the National Park Service on some stuff, and we're kind of earlier. We're at an earlier stage in that than we are with Amanda, because they got shut down like hard by COVID in a way to where they weren't letting people into visitor centers or anything like that. And so it was very, very difficult for us to kind of move forward on that. So I have talked with some of the folks out at Stones River National Battlefield is really close to my house. So I was reached out to some of the staff that I knew there. But most of the collaboration we've done with the National Park Service has been around interpretation, specifically the historic weapons demonstration program is the most kind of blaring example of that, where we've worked with the National Park Service on developing our historic weapons demonstration policies. But we started, but we haven't. That's much further away than it has been working with Amanda at the State Museum.
And our final question, and we might have touched on this previously. I think this was one of the earlier ones. I'm sorry, I'm getting to your question last, but is there an effort to preserve archival materials at Tennessee State Parks? So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's.
Yes, there is. So we've been working. I've also been through TAM. I met Myers Brown a few years ago, and Myers was also involved with preserving the archival holdings at Mac's house. Mac was a prolific photographer, and Mac's involvement with conservation organizations across the state took the form of letter writing, those kinds of things. So we've worked in partnership with the Tennessee State Library and Archives on preserving Mac stuff there. Currently, right now, we are working with the Tennessee State Library and Archives on developing a small archival storage space at Cedars 11 and State Park, which is where I've been for the last 2 days, gutting a building to get ready for that. And so we're working and using that space as kind of like a temporary holding place to get things processed and cleaned at the archival holdings for state parks. We're also looking at doing that with some museum items as well, which is why it's been so important to work with Amanda on like collections and collections policies.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Amanda and Hobart, for that wonderful session. And I just have to mention, in the chat, people are really appreciating some of the artwork behind Amanda, particularly a long-faced gentleman and a very presidential looking horse.
There's a cow too.
They're appreciating your. Oh, there you go.
So this is my wall of thrift store art. If you want to see it. And all of these things on the wall came from. They're all under $20. The most expensive one is the pink one there, but the horse and the cow were, I think, 50 cents each at a yard sale. So, and I did mention to Spencer earlier that this is my art wall where I staged the fact that my house looks this nice all over, but it does not. This is my fancy wall where I give presentations. But thank you. I appreciate you that someone likes my thrift store art.
Well, thank you again both for this session. And I do want to remind everyone, if they would please take the survey below, if you'll just scroll down a little bit, and enjoy the rest of the sessions on the final day of the TAM conference. Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.